I've been asked to share a story from my experiences as an exorcist, and I want to dive right in without much preamble, because these tales aren't for entertainment, they're reminders of the spiritual battles we all face in this world. This one took place back in 2010 in a small town along the river in Indiana, not far from where the Ohio River bends and the woods grow thick and ancient. It's a real case, one that still weighs on my heart, involving a man named Thomas Reed, a solitary soul who worked as a forest ranger, living alone in a log cabin near a protected area called Lover's Leap. That place has its own history, tied to old legends of heartbreak and mystery. But what happened to Thomas was no legend. It was a direct encounter with evil, manifesting through a curse from a flock of birds, tied to the ancient demon Baal from the scriptures. It started in the fall of that year, when the leaves were turning those deep reds and golds that blanket the Midwest, and the nights were getting longer, cooler, with that crisp bite in the air that signals winter's approach. Thomas was 38, a sturdy man, about 6 feet tall, built from years of hiking trails and chopping wood, living off the grid in his cabin, maybe a mile or so from the nearest neighbor. He wasn't a churchgoer, not regularly anyway, raised Catholic, but drifted away, like so many do when life gets routine and faith seems distant. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, he first noticed the birds, starlings, black as midnight, hundreds of them, gathering on the oak branches around his home. They weren't just perching quietly. No, they were calling out in this eerie rhythmic chorus, like a funeral dirge echoing through the darkness. It wasn't the usual chatter of birds settling in for the night. It was piercing, almost human in its lament, rising and falling in waves that sent chills down his spine. Thomas told me later, when I met him, how he'd step out onto his porch, shotgun in hand, and fire a few rounds into the air to scatter them. Buckshot scattering leaves and twigs, but those birds, they'd flutter up in a black cloud, swirling like smoke from a fire, only to settle back down moments later, their eyes glinting under the moonlight like tiny coals. He'd reload, fire again, but it was futile. Night after night, this went on, starting around dusk and lasting until the wee hours. He figured at first it was some migration pattern gone wrong, maybe the changing weather driving them mad. But deep down, he knew it wasn't natural. These weren't ordinary starlings. Their calls had a mocking quality, almost whispering his name in the wind. Thomas, Thomas. Or so he thought at first, dismissing it as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Then came the first real sign that something darker was at play. One morning, after a particularly restless night where the birds' cries had kept him tossing in his bed, he stepped outside to find a single starling dead on his doorstep. Not just dead, mutilated in a way that no predator would do. Its body was intact, feathers sleek, but carved into its chest was a symbol, a circle enclosing an inverted five-pointed star, the pentagram turned upside down, a mark I've seen in my line of work associated with occult summons and demonic pacts. Thomas picked it up with a stick, tossed it into the woods, but that image burned into his memory. He didn't know what it meant then, but it unsettled him, made him lock his doors tighter, keep his Bible dusty from disuse closer to his bedside. As the days wore on, the flock grew. What started as hundreds became thousands, blanketing the trees like a living shroud. Neighbors miles away could hear the racket, but it was centered on Thomas's cabin, as if drawn to him specifically. Martha Collins, his closest neighbor, a retired nurse in her 60s, God-fearing woman who'd lost her husband years back, she noticed it too. She'd drive by on her way to town, see the birds swirling, and wave to Thomas, but he'd just nod curtly, his face growing paler, eyes shadowed. She told me how one evening she stopped by with a pie apple fresh from her oven and found him staring out the window, muttering about the choir of the damned. That's what he called their cries. A choir singing praises to something unholy. I remember when I first got the call about this case. It came through the Archdiocese in Indianapolis, where I've served as pastor at St. Malachy Parish, and also as the designated exorcist since 2005. Bishop had appointed me after training in Rome, where I learned from experienced exorcists about the rites and the realities of demonic oppression. But this wasn't my first rodeo. By 2010, I'd handled dozens of cases. from possessions tied to Ouija boards to curses from generational sins. The local priest in that Indiana town, Father John Whitaker, a good man, solid in his faith, had reached out initially, but as things escalated, they looped me in because of my experience with ancient entities like Baal. You see, Baal isn't just a name from old myths. He's referenced in the Bible in 2 Kings as a false god, a demon who demands worship through manipulation, pride, and violence. He often manifests through nature storms, animals, birds twisting God's creation to his will. Back to Thomas. Those nights grew worse. He'd wake from nightmares, sweating through his sheets, dreaming of a tall figure in a black cloak, faceless but with eyes like burning embers, calling his name in a voice that rumbled like thunder. Ball, serve, ball. He'd bolt upright, heart pounding, only to hear the birds outside mimicking that call, their shrieks blending into words that no animal should utter. He tried everything, earplugs, whiskey, to dull the senses, but nothing worked. His health started slipping, headaches like vices clamping his skull, fatigue that left him dragging through his ranger duties. One day, patrolling the trails about 5 miles of winding paths through Lover's Leap, he found more dead birds, each with that same inverted pentagram etched somehow into their flesh, as if burned by an invisible hand. Martha, bless her soul, she was the one who first suspected the spiritual angle. As a devout Catholic, she'd seen enough in her nursing days, patients tormented by unseen forces, whispering confessions of deals with the devil. She confronted Thomas one afternoon, found him slumped on his porch, shotgun across his lap, eyes bloodshot. "This ain't natural, Tom," she said. "You need prayer, maybe more." He laughed it off at first, called it superstition, but inside, fear was gnawing at him. That night, the birds didn't just cry, they swarmed closer, pecking at his windows, leaving scratches on the glass like tiny claws. He fired his gun again, pellets ripping through the flock, dropping a few, but the rest reformed, their calls now laced with laughter, mocking his efforts. I think about that isolation often in my ministry. Thomas lived alone by choice, proud of his self-reliance, thinking he didn't need community or God. But evil preys on that, on the lonely, the arrogant. As St. Paul warns in Ephesians, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. Those birds were the first wave, the harbingers of Baal's claim on his soul. And as the signs multiplied, it became clear this was no mere infestation. It was an invitation from hell itself, scratching at the door of a man's heart. Let me paint the picture more vividly, because these details matter. They show how subtle evil can be at first, lulling you before the strike. Imagine that cabin, rough-hewn logs, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with a stone fireplace and a single bulb swinging from the ceiling. Outside, the river murmurs half a mile away, but drowned out by the cacophony of wings and beaks. Thomas would pace the floorboards, creaking under his boots, peering through the curtains at the black mass in the trees. One night, he swore he saw shapes among them, not just birds, but shadows flitting, humanoid, whispering, in a tongue he didn't recognize. Later, we'd identify it as ancient Hebrew, words from rituals long forbidden. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay, even though no bodies rotted nearby. His food spoiled faster, milk curdling overnight, bread molding in hours. Pets? He had a dog once, a loyal hound named Rex, but it had run off weeks before, howling into the woods as if fleeing a predator. Thomas searched for miles, calling its name, but found only paw prints leading to a clearing where more birds perched, silent for once, watching him with those gleaming eyes. Friends, if you've ever felt that chill, that sense of being watched in the dark, multiply it 100-fold. That's what Thomas endured, and it was just the beginning. As an exorcist, I've learned that demons like Baal don't rush. They erode bit by bit, testing defenses. Those cries in the night weren't random, they were a summons, pulling at the threads of his soul. To give you a sense of the scale, picture this. Lover's Leap spans about 2,000 acres of dense forest, cliffs overlooking the river, a place where lovers supposedly jumped in old tales, but also rumored for darker rites. Thomas's cabin sat on the edge, isolated, perfect for such an assault. The birds' flock, by his estimate, numbered in the thousands. Their combined weight-bending branches, leaves falling like confetti from hell. He tried to sleep, but the noise penetrated everything, walls, pillows over his head. It drove him to the brink, making him question his sanity. Martha tried helping early on. She'd bring holy water from church, sprinkle it around, but Thomas waved it away, embarrassed. "I'm fine," he'd say, but his voice trembled. One dawn, after a sleepless night, he found the symbol again, not on a bird, but scratched into his door, deep gouges as if from talons. That's when panic set in. He drove into town about 10 miles away, bought more ammo, locks, even a crucifix on a whim from a thrift store. Hung it on the wall, but it fell that night, clattering to the floor as the birds screamed louder. I recall in my training, the exorcists in Rome spoke of signs like this: unnatural animal behavior, symbols appearing, voices in the wind. It's classic oppression, the stage before full possession. Baal, as a biblical entity, loves to corrupt nature. Remember how he was challenged by Elijah on Mount Carmel, where fire from heaven proved God's supremacy. Here it was birds instead of bulls, but the intent was the same, to draw worship through fear. As the weeks dragged on, fall deepening, temperatures dropping to the 40s at night, Thomas's world shrank to that cabin, besieged. He'd radio his ranger station, report sick, but couldn't explain the truth. Isolation bred despair, and that's fertile ground for demons. One evening, as twilight fell, the birds formed patterns in the sky, swirling into that inverted star, then diving low, brushing his roof. He felt a presence then, heavy, oppressive, like a weight on his chest. That's the essence of the first signs, subtle yet relentless, building to something terrifying, and it only got worse from there, leading to the whispers that would haunt his mind. But that's for another part of the story. For now, remember this: evil often starts with a whisper, or in this case, a cry in the night, testing if you'll listen or turn to God. Let me expand on that night he found the first marked bird, because it's pivotal. He stepped out at sunrise, the air misty, dew on the grass, and there it lay, wings folded neatly, as if placed deliberately. The carving was precise, not ragged lines straight, the circle perfect, star points sharp, no blood, just the mark. He buried it, but dug it up later, curiosity overriding fear, only to find the body gone, hole empty. That shook him more than anything. Neighbors whispered too. Martha heard from folks in town, fishermen on the river, seeing bird swarms, unnatural for the season. One old-timer recalled similar events decades back, but dismissed as folklore. Thomas didn't know then, but Lover's Leap had a shadowed past, tied to occult groups in the mid-20th century, summoning entities for power. That history would surface later, but in those early days, it was just the birds, the mark, the dreams. In my experience, such manifestations target the vulnerable. Thomas's pride, his "I don't need anyone" attitude, opened the door. As Proverbs says, pride goes before destruction. He thought he could handle it alone, but no one can face darkness without light. The cries evolved too, at first random, then synchronized, like a chant. He'd recorded on an old tape recorder, play back, hear words embedded, B-A-A-L, Lord. Serve. Chilled him to the bone. He smashed the tape, but the memory lingered. One storm, night, rain pounding, wind howling, the birds stayed, unflinching, their calls cutting through the thunder. Lightning illuminated them, thousands strong, unmoving. That's when he first prayed, awkwardly, "God, if you're there," but doubt choked the words. Martha saw the change, visited again, found him thinner, 10 pounds lost in weeks, face gaunt. She urged church, but he resisted. Yet the seed was planted. Friends, this is how it begins. Not with bangs, but whispers, cries, signs. Heed them, turn to faith early, because ignoring invites deeper intrusion. To truly convey the terror, imagine lying there, alone, miles from help, birds encircling, their presence palpable, sleep evaded, mind racing. That's oppression's grip. And so the The stage was set for what came next, the weakening, the voices inside, but for now, that's the foundation. The cries in the night, the first signs of a curse from the flock. God bless you all as you reflect on this. Picture Thomas in his cabin, a man who once prided himself on needing no one, now barely sleeping, his world shrinking to the creak of floorboards and the relentless screech of those birds outside. It was late October, the air sharp with frost, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones when you're alone in a forest stretching 2,000 acres. The starlings hadn't left. If anything, their numbers grew, their cries sharper, more insistent, like a congregation chanting in a language just beyond understanding. But what began as external torment soon crept inward, burrowing into Thomas's thoughts, his dreams, his very being. This is how demons work, not with sudden theatrics, but with a slow, grinding erosion, exploiting every crack in a person's resolve. It started with the headaches. Thomas described them to me later as like a hammer striking his skull, not steady but pulsing, as if timed to the rhythm of the birds' calls. He'd wake in the dead of night, maybe 3 a.m, clutching his temples, the pain so fierce he'd see flashes of light behind his eyes. He tried aspirin, whiskey, even an old ranger's trick of pressing cold river stones to his forehead, but nothing eased it. The headaches came with a new symptom, whispers. Not the birds now, but voices inside his head, soft at first like a radio-tuned low, murmuring words he couldn't quite catch. He'd sit by his fireplace, the only warmth in that drafty cabin, staring into the flames and hear them. Thomas, weak, alone. At first, he thought it was exhaustion, his mind playing tricks after sleepless nights. But the whispers grew clearer, more deliberate, and they weren't in English. Now, Thomas was no scholar. He dropped out of high school, learned his trade through grit and experience, not books. He knew the woods, the trails, the habits of deer and foxes, but languages? He could barely manage a few Spanish phrases from coworkers. Yet these whispers, as he later confessed to me, came in a tongue he'd never heard, guttural and ancient, like stones grinding together. One night, alone with a flickering lantern, he scribbled down what he could make out phonetically on a scrap of paper. Baruch, Atah, Baal, Adonai. He didn't know it then. But those were fragments of ancient Hebrew, a language tied to rituals, both holy and profane. When I saw that paper handed to me by his neighbor Martha, it chilled me. Those weren't words a man like Thomas could conjure. They were the signature of something old, something that had walked the earth long before us. Martha Collins, that steadfast woman in her 60s, was the first to notice Thomas's decline beyond the physical. She'd stop by every few days, bringing soup or bread, her way of checking on a man too proud to ask for help. She found him changed, not just tired, but hollow, his blue eyes dull, his frame thinner, maybe 15 pounds gone in a month. He'd snap at her, not with his usual gruff humor, but with a venom that wasn't his. One afternoon, as she offered to pray with him, he laughed a harsh barking sound and said words she didn't understand, words that made her cross herself and step back. Later, she told me they sounded like curses, not just in tone, but in their weight, as if they carried a malice that hung in the air. She wrote them down too, and when I consulted a scholar in Indianapolis, he confirmed Hebrew, ancient, and liturgical, phrases tied to idol worship, specifically to Baal. This wasn't just psychological strain. In my training in Rome, I learned the signs of demonic oppression, physical deterioration, knowledge of things beyond a person's capacity, and a hostility toward the sacred. Thomas was showing all three. He'd stopped eating much, living on coffee and stale bread, his cabin a mess of unwashed dishes and scattered papers. But more alarming was his sudden outburst. Martha saw him one evening, standing on his porch, shouting at the birds, not in anger, but in response, as if arguing with them. She swore she heard him say, "I won't bow," in a voice too deep, too resonant to be his own. The birds answered, their cries rising to a crescendo, a black cloud swirling above the trees, forming shapes that Martha described as unnatural spirals, stars, fleeting human forms. I got involved when Father John Whitaker, the local priest, called me. I was serving at St. Malachy in Brownsburg, handling parish duties alongside my role, as the archdiocese exorcist. John had visited Thomas after Martha's urging, and what he saw troubled him deeply. Thomas wasn't just unwell, he was unraveling. John found him sitting in the dark, no lights, no fire, just the glow of moonlight through the windows, surrounded by feathers, starling feathers, scattered across the floor like ash. Thomas was muttering not to John, but to himself, or so it seemed. When John spoke, offering a blessing, Thomas's head snapped up, eyes wild, and he spat out, "Your God has no power here." The words weren't his. They carried that same guttural tone, laced with contempt. John, a seasoned priest, knew this wasn't mental illness alone. He'd seen cases of distress, but this was different, calculated, malevolent. John sprinkled holy water, a simple test we use in discernment. Thomas recoiled, not dramatically like in movies, but subtly, hissing through clenched teeth, his hands twitching as if burned. That's when John reached out to me, knowing my experience with entities like BAAL. In the Bible, BAAL is no mere myth. He's a principality, a demon who thrives on pride, drawing people away from God through promises of power or self-sufficiency. He's subtle, unlike lesser spirits who rely on fear alone. BAAL plants seeds, whispers, doubts, and in Thomas's case, exploited his isolation, his belief that he could face the world alone. The whispers in Thomas's head grew worse. By now, they weren't just at night. He'd hear them on his ranger patrols, 5-mile treks through Lover's Leap, where the trails wound past cliffs and ancient oaks. He'd stop mid-step as the voices spoke. "You are mine, no one else." They'd come with visions, flashes of that cloaked figure from his dreams, tall as a tree, standing at the edge of the clearing, its voice booming, "Serve Baal and be free." Thomas told me he'd shake his head, try to focus on the trail markers, but the visions persisted, sometimes showing him scenes of fire, of the town burning, of himself standing over it, exalted. That's Baal's tactic. He tempts with grandeur, feeding the ego until it consumes you. One incident stood out, chilling even to me. Thomas was checking a trail near the river, about a mile from his cabin, when he found another dead starling, its chest carved with that inverted pentagram. But this time, it wasn't alone. Around it, in a perfect circle, were dozens of feathers, arranged as if placed by hand, forming the same symbol. He kicked them apart, heart racing, but as he did, the whispers surged, loud enough to drown out the river's rush. "You cannot escape." He ran back to his cabin, locked the door. But the voices followed, now joined by a new sensation, a pressure in his chest, like hands squeezing his lungs, making each breath a struggle. Martha, God bless her, didn't give up. She brought her rosary one day, sat with Thomas despite his protests, and prayed aloud. He didn't join her, but he didn't stop her either, a small victory. She noticed something odd. When she prayed the Our Father, the birds outside fell silent, just for a moment, as if listening. But when she mentioned Jesus' name, Thomas flinched, his fingers digging into the armrests of his chair. She told me later it was like watching a man fight an invisible enemy, his body tense, sweat beating despite the cold. I visited Thomas myself after John's call, driving the 50 miles from Brownsburg to that river town. I found the cabin just as described, isolated, surrounded by oaks, heavy with starlings, their cries deafening even in daylight. Thomas greeted me warily, his handshake weak, his eyes avoiding mine. I carried my ritual kit, holy water, crucifix, the Roman ritual book, and began with simple questions. When did it start? What did he feel? He was reluctant, but the dam broke when I mentioned the birds. He poured out the story, the headaches, the whispers, the dreams of Baal. I asked about his faith, and he admitted he hadn't prayed in years, hadn't confessed since childhood. That's a door left ajar, friends. One the enemy loves to push open. I tested the ground, so to speak. I prayed a simple blessing over the cabin, watching Thomas closely. He shifted uncomfortably, his breathing shallow. When I sprinkled holy water, he didn't react violently, but his eyes darted to the windows, where the birds had gone quiet. I read from Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," and he mouthed the words almost against his will, as if something deep inside still clung to faith. But then the whispers came again. He clutched his head, muttering, stop it, not to me, but to the voices. I knew then we were dealing with oppression, possibly possession, and it was escalating fast. In my work, I've seen how demons target the mind first, sowing doubt, fear, and despair. Thomas's isolation made him vulnerable. His pride and self-reliance was the cracked ball exploited. As St. Peter warns, the devil prowls like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Those whispers were Baal's claws, digging deeper, preparing for the next phase. Thomas was fighting, but he was losing ground, and soon the darkness would spill outward, affecting others. Martha reported one final detail that sealed my resolve. One night, she saw Thomas outside, not on his porch, but in the yard, standing still as the birds swarmed above. He wasn't shouting now. He was listening, head tilted as if receiving instructions. She called out, but he didn't respond, just turned and walked back inside, leaving a trail of feathers behind. That's when she knew, and so did I. We needed to act, to prepare for a battle not just for Thomas's soul, but against a force that had claimed that forest long ago. This is where the story turns, friends, toward the history of Lover's Leap and the darkness buried there, waiting to be unearthed. Hold fast to your faith, for as Ephesians tells us, we must put on the armor of God to stand against such evil. God bless you all as we continue this journey. By now, late October had settled over the town, the air heavy with the scent of fallen leaves and the river's muddy breath, the nights dipping into the low 40s, frost glazing the trails Thomas once patrolled with pride. His cabin, a rough square of logs about 20 by 30 feet, stood isolated at the edge of Lover's Leap, a 2,000-acre sprawl of oaks, cliffs, and secrets. The starlings still swarmed, their numbers swelling to thousands, their cries a constant assault, but now joined by Thomas's own unraveling headaches that crippled him, visions of a cloaked figure promising power, and those whispers, now clear enough to form phrases like Baal is Lord in a language he'd never studied. Martha Collins, his neighbor, a devout woman in her 60s, and Father John Whitaker, the local priest, had seen enough to call me in, knowing my training in Rome and my role as the Archdiocese exorcist since 2005. But what turned this case from troubling to urgent was a discovery that tied Thomas's torment to a past long forgotten by the town. It was Martha who found it, bless her persistent heart. She'd taken to checking on Thomas daily, braving the mile-long dirt road to his cabin, despite the birds' relentless screeching and the growing sense of dread that hung over the place. One morning, after finding Thomas slumped in a chair, staring blankly at a wall streaked with scratches, marks he couldn't explain, she decided to clean up a bit, hoping to bring some order to his chaos. In a dusty corner of the cabin, under a pile of old ranger maps and empty coffee cans, she found a small wooden box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, its lid carved with a faint circle and star, not unlike the ones on the dead birds. Inside was a journal, its leather cover cracked, pages yellowed and brittle, smelling of mildew and time. The journal belonged to a man named Ezekiel Hart, a forest ranger like Thomas, who'd lived in that same cabin in the 1940s. Martha brought it to me when I visited next, her hands trembling as she handed it over, saying, "Father, this ain't just a book, it's a warning." I sat at Thomas's table, the air thick with a scent of damp wood and something fouler, like sulfur, and read by lantern light while the starlings screamed outside. Ezekiel's entries started mundane notes on trail maintenance, wildlife sightings, weather patterns, but by 1942, they turned strange. He wrote of meetings in the woods, gatherings of men and women from nearby towns, cloaked figures who came at midnight to a clearing near the cliffs. They called themselves the Order of the Star, a name that sent a chill through me, for I'd heard of such groups in my studies, cults that dabbled in the occult, seeking power through forbidden rites. Ezekiel's words grew frantic over months. He described rituals under the full moon, where the group chanted in a tongue he didn't understand Hebrew, he guessed, though he wasn't sure. They burned fires in the shape of a 5-pointed star, inverted and offered blood, not human, thank God, but animals, rabbits, and birds, their bodies marked with that same symbol we'd seen. Ezekiel wasn't a participant. He'd stumbled on them during a patrol, hidden in the brush, watching in horror. He wrote, "They called a Baal, a name I heard in Sunday school, but this ain't no Bible story. They want strength, protection, but something answers, and it ain't God." The journal detailed how the group believed Lover's Leap was sacred, a thin place where the veil between worlds was weak, perfect for summoning entities. They thought Baal would grant them dominion over the land, wealth, power, but Ezekiel saw what came instead: madness, sickness, death. By 1943, the entries grew sparse. Ezekiel noted that members of the order began to vanish, one found dead in the river, another gone mad, ranting about birds that followed him. The last entry, dated July 4th, 1943, was scrawled in a shaking hand. "They woke something in the forest. It's in the trees, in the birds. Baal took them and now it watches me. I'm leaving this place." That was it. No record of where Ezekiel went, if he survived, or why the journal stayed behind. But as I read, the starlings outside grew louder, as if responding to the words, their cries forming a rhythm that echoed the chants Ezekiel described. This history changed everything. In my work, I've learned that demons don't just appear, they're invited, whether through sin, pride, or rituals like these. BAAL had been called to Lover's Leap decades ago, and though the order was gone, its presence lingered, tethered to the land, waiting for a soul like Thomas, isolated, proud, vulnerable. The journal explained the birds, the symbols, the whispers in Hebrew. It wasn't random. It was a legacy of evil, a curse rooted in the soil of that forest. I shared this with Father John, and we agreed. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. The land itself was tainted, a stronghold for BAAL, who used the starlings as his heralds, his spies. Thomas, meanwhile, was slipping further. Martha told me he'd stopped going to work, his radio silent, his Ranger truck parked crooked in the yard, tires sinking into the mud. She found him one evening sitting outside, not on the porch, but in the grass, surrounded by feathers, his hands stained with dirt, as if he'd been digging. He wasn't himself. His voice, when he spoke, was low, deliberate, saying, "The forest knows me." Martha tried to pull him inside, but he pushed her away, not hard, but enough to scare her. She noticed his eyes, pupils dilated, almost black, reflecting the moonlight like the starling's eyes. She prayed the rosary right there, clutching her beads, and for a moment, Thomas softened, tears streaking his face, but then he laughed, a sound that wasn't his, and walked into the cabin, slamming the door. I returned to the cabin with Father John, carrying the journal and my ritual kit. Thomas was worse, pale, gaunt, maybe 20 pounds lighter now, his clothes hanging loose. He barely acknowledged us, sitting by the cold fireplace, staring at the scratches on the walls, which now formed patterns, circles, stars, lines that matched the journal's descriptions. I asked about the voices, and he admitted they were constant now, not just at night, but all day, urging him to join the fire, to stand with BALL. He showed me his hands calloused from work, but now marked with cuts, as if he'd been clawing at something, maybe himself. I sprinkled holy water, read from Psalm 91, "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge." And Thomas flinched, not violently, but enough to confirm the presence of something unholy. I confronted him about the journal, reading aloud Ezekiel's words. He listened, head bowed, but when I mentioned Baal, he froze, then whispered, "He's here," pointing to his chest. Not his head, not the room, his heart. That's when I knew we were nearing possession, not just oppression. Baal was digging in, claiming territory, using the history of that land to anchor itself. I've seen this before, demons latching onto places where sin was invited, like a house built on a fault line. Lover's Leap was such a place, its beauty masking a wound that never healed. Martha, despite her fear, kept digging too. She spoke to old-timers in town, men and women in their 80s, who remembered the 1940s. One, a former logger named Henry, recalled rumors of night meetings in the woods, of people who'd changed after joining families broken, minds lost. He said the birds were part of it even then, starlings gathering in unnatural numbers, following those who'd meddled with the order. Henry crossed himself, saying, "We thought it was over when they left, but the forest don't forget." His words echoed Ezekiel's, and I felt the weight of history pressing down, a cycle of evil waiting to repeat. In my training, we learned that places can be oppressed as much as people. Sacred ground can be defiled, turned into a stronghold for powers and principalities, as Ephesians warns. Lover's Leap was such a place, its cliffs and oaks a temple for Baal's lingering presence. The journal was our map, showing how the demon had been summoned, how it killed those who called it, and how it waited for someone new. Thomas, with his solitary life, his pride in standing alone, was the perfect vessel. Before we left that day, I blessed the cabin again, praying the prayer to St. Michael. The birds went silent just for a moment, but Thomas's reaction was stronger. He groaned, a low animal sound, and slumped forward as if exhausted. I knew we had to act fast. Father John and I agreed to contact the Archdiocese for permission to perform an exorcism, but first, we needed to prepare Thomas to see if he could muster the faith to fight. Because, friends, no rite works without the will of the person, without their cry to God for deliverance. This discovery, the journal, the history, set the stage for the battle ahead. It wasn't just Thomas we were fighting for, but the soul of that land, stained by sins long past. As we move forward, we'll see the darkness spill out, touching others, demanding a response. Hold fast to your faith, for as Christ says in John, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. God bless you all as we continue. November had crept in, the air now bitter, temperatures hovering in the high 30s at night, the Ohio River a cold, sluggish ribbon reflecting the moon over Lover's Leap's 2,000-acre expanse. Thomas's cabin, that rough-hewn shelter of logs, stood like a lone sentinel, surrounded by oaks heavy with starlings, their cries now a constant, mocking hymn that seemed to pulse with the demon's will. Thomas was a shadow of himself, gaunt, eyes sunken, maybe 25 pounds lighter, his ranger duties abandoned, his truck rusting in the yard. The whispers in his head had grown into commands, urging him to join the fire, to bow to Baal, and his resistance was crumbling, worn down by sleepless nights and visions of a cloaked figure promising dominion. Martha Collins, his steadfast neighbor, and Father John Whitaker, the local priest, had brought me into this fight. My training in Rome, and role as the Archdiocese exorcist since 2005, guiding our steps. But what happened next turned this from a personal struggle to a public crisis, forcing us to act before the demon claimed more than Thomas's soul. It began with an outsider, a man named Paul Bennett, a biologist from a nearby college, about 40 years old, lean and curious, known for studying local wildlife. Martha, ever vigilant, had called him, hoping science might explain the starlings' unnatural behavior, thousands gathering, forming patterns in the sky, their eyes glinting like polished onyx. Paul arrived one gray morning, his pickup crunching down the mile-long dirt road to Thomas's cabin, armed with binoculars, a notebook, and a recorder to capture the birds' calls. Martha met him there, her rosary clutched tight, her face pale from days of worry. Thomas was inside, sitting by the cold fireplace, staring at the wall where scratches now formed intricate designs, circles within stars, lines weaving like a map of some unholy realm. Paul, skeptical but professional, set up outside, observing the flock from a safe distance, or so he thought. The starlings were relentless, their cries sharper than ever, forming a black cloud that seemed to pulse with intent. Paul noted their behavior was abnormal, no migratory pattern, no natural cause for their fixation on the cabin. He found feathers scattered in patterns, not random but deliberate, echoing the pentagrams we'd seen. He told Martha, "This isn't biology, it's something else." But before he could finish his notes, Thomas emerged, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, his eyes fixed on Paul. Martha later described it as if Thomas wasn't walking but being pulled like a puppet on strings. Paul, unaware of the danger, greeted him, asking about the birds. That's when it happened. Without warning, Thomas lunged, a hunting knife in his hand, 6 inches of steel, kept for skinning game. He slashed at Paul, catching his arm, the blade slicing deep into muscle. Blood sprayed, red against the gray morning, and Paul staggered back, clutching the wound, shock in his eyes. Martha screamed, dropping her rosary, and ran to Paul, pressing her scarf against the gash to stem the bleeding. Thomas stood frozen, the knife dangling, his face blank, then twisted into a sneer that wasn't his. He spoke, not in English, but in that guttural Hebrew, words Martha couldn't understand, but felt like curses, heavy with hate. The birds above erupted, swirling into a vortex, their cries drowning out Paul's groans. Martha, brave despite her fear, shouted, "In the name of Jesus, stop." And Thomas flinched, dropping the knife, his body shaking as if waking from a trance. He stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door, while the birds scattered, then reformed, watching from the trees. Paul's wound was severe, 15 stitches at the hospital in town, 10 miles away. He survived, but his arm would never fully heal, the scar a permanent reminder. Martha called Father John, who called me, urgency in his voice. I drove the 50 miles from Brownsburg, my ritual kit on the seat beside me, holy water, crucifix, the Roman ritual book, knowing we were past discernment. This was no longer oppression, it was possession, or close to it. Baal had moved from whispers to action, using Thomas's body to lash out. A sign the demon was growing bolder, its grip tighter. When I arrived, the cabin felt heavier, the air thick with a presence that pressed against my chest. Martha was there, shaken but resolute, her rosary back in hand. Paul, bandaged and pale, had insisted on returning, not for science now, but for answers. He showed me his recordings, bird calls laced with sounds no animal could make, syllables that matched the Hebrew phrases Thomas had spoken. I listened, and it chilled me. Baruch Baal, Adonai Shel Olam, praises to Baal, twisted into blasphemy. Paul, a man of logic, admitted, "Father, I don't believe in this stuff, but I can't explain it." I nodded, knowing faith isn't required to see evil's work, only to fight it. Inside, Thomas was a wreck. He sat in a corner, knees drawn up, muttering, "I didn't mean it. It wasn't me." His hands trembled, the cuts on them deeper, as if he clawed at his own skin. I asked about the attack, and he wept, saying he saw Paul but not as a man, as a threat, a shadow sent to stop him. The voices had screamed, "Kill or be killed," and his body moved without his will. That's possession's edge, friends, when the demon overrides the soul, turning a man into a tool. I've seen it before, in cases across Indiana, where the enemy exploits weakness, pride, or despair. Thomas's isolation, his refusal of community, had left him open, and BAL was pouring through that gap. Martha showed me the journal again, Ezekiel Hart's words from the 1940s, and pointed to a passage we'd missed. The order thought they could control it, but BAL turned their hands against each other. It described a night when members fought, blood spilled in the clearing, their own knives turned on allies under the demon's sway. The parallel was clear. Thomas's attack wasn't random, but a replay of history, BAL reenacting its chaos. I knew then we needed more than prayers. We needed the full authority of the church. I called the Archdiocese in Indianapolis, requesting permission for a solemn exorcism, a process requiring the bishop's approval, medical evaluations, and proof of demonic activity. Thomas's case checked every box: unnatural knowledge, aversion to the sacred, physical changes, and now violence. While waiting, I stayed with Thomas, testing his responses. I read from the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus casts out demons, and Thomas writhed, not dramatically, but enough, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting to the windows where the birds watched, silent now, as if waiting. I sprinkled holy water, and he hissed, a low sound, not his voice, but something deeper, saying, "You waste your time, priest." I've heard such taunts before. Demons love to mock, to sow doubt. But I held firm, praying the litany of the saints, and Thomas calmed, if only slightly, whispering, "Help me, Father." That was his soul, still fighting, a spark of hope we could build on. Martha and Paul, despite his injury, refused to leave. Martha prayed constantly, her voice steady through the Our Father, though the birds screeched when she reached, "Deliver us from evil." Paul, no believer, stayed out of duty, documenting the birds' patterns, noting how they moved in unison like a single mind. He found more feathers, arranged in circles near the cabin, and one dead starling with a fresh pentagram, its body still warm. He brought it to me, wrapped in a cloth, and I saw the precision lines carved as if by a scalpel, no blood, just the mark. I blessed the ground where it lay, and the birds above went wild, diving at the windows, cracking glass with their beaks. The town was stirring now. Word of the attack spread, and folks who dismissed the birds as a nuisance began to whisper of curses, of the old stories from the 1940s. An elderly woman, a friend of Martha's, recalled her father warning about Lover's Leap, saying, "Don't go there at night, the birds see you." The fear was palpable, and Father John held a special mass at his church, praying for protection, though he didn't name Thomas. I joined him, preaching on Ephesians 6, the armor of God, urging the people to cling to faith, not fear, for fear is the demon's fuel. Thomas's cry for help, that faint, "Help me, Father," was our anchor. I spent hours with him, urging him to confess, to return to the sacraments. He resisted, saying he didn't deserve forgiveness, that the voices told him he was damned. That's Baal's lie, friends making you feel beyond God's reach. I countered with John's gospel. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Slowly, Thomas began to pray, haltingly, the act of contrition, his voice breaking. It was a start, but the battle was far from over. The attack on Paul was the demon's escalation, a sign it feared our intervention. Baal wasn't content with Thomas alone. It wanted chaos to spread its influence. As we prepared for the exorcism, we knew the fight would test us all, mind, body, and soul. The next step was to ready Thomas, to arm him with faith, for no rite succeeds without the person's will aligned with God's. Hold fast, friends, for as we move to the preparation, the darkness grows bolder, and the forest itself seems to rise against us. God bless you all as we continue. November's chill had settled deep, the air biting at 35 degrees under a sky heavy with clouds. The Ohio River a cold mirror, reflecting the unease over Lover's Leap. Thomas's log cabin, 20 by 30 feet of weathered timber, stood like a fortress under siege, its windows scarred by starling beaks, the oaks around it laden with thousands of birds, their cries now a relentless chant, synchronized as if directed by a single malevolent mind. Thomas was a husk 30 pounds lighter, his eyes hollow, his voice a whisper broken by moments of unnatural depth when Baal spoke through him. The attack on Paul, slashing his arm with a hunting knife, had confirmed possession, not just oppression. Martha Collins, the steadfast neighbor in her 60s, and Father John Whitaker, the local priest, stood with me, my training in Rome and role as the Archdiocese exorcist since 2005 guiding us. But before we could wield the church's rite, we had to prepare Thomas, ourselves, and the very ground we stood on. Preparation for an exorcism is no small task. It's not just opening the Roman ritual and reading prayers. It's a spiritual armoring, a rallying of faith, because no rite works without the person's will aligned with God's. Thomas was slipping, his soul battered by Baal's lies. "You are mine, you are damned," and his body weakened by sleeplessness and torment. My first step was to meet with Father John and Martha at the local church, a modest brick building 10 miles from the cabin, its steeple a quiet beacon in the town. We knelt in the sanctuary before the tabernacle and prayed for guidance, invoking St. Michael and the Blessed Virgin. I've learned in my ministry that exorcism is a team effort, not just priests, but the faithful, lifting the afflicted in prayer. Martha, her rosary worn smooth from use, led us in the sorrowful mysteries, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I contacted the Archdiocese in Indianapolis, 50 miles away, to finalize permission for the solemn exorcism. The bishop required a medical evaluation to rule out mental illness, so we arranged for Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychiatrist from the city, to assess Thomas. She was a Catholic, familiar with my work, and understood the line between pathology and the supernatural. I drove her to the cabin, the dirt road rutted from recent rains, the starlings watching from every branch. Thomas sat inside, wrapped in a blanket despite the fire Martha had lit. Dr. Harper spent an hour with him, noting his physical decline, malnutrition, dehydration, erratic pulse, but what struck her was his speech. He alternated between sobs, begging for help, and bursts of Hebrew. Phrases like Baal Yimloch, meaning Baal will reign. She tested his cognition. He knew his name, the date, but when asked about faith, he froze, then spat, "God abandoned me." Dr. Harper concluded, no schizophrenia, no psychosis, but something beyond her science. She signed the report, clearing the way for the rite. Back at the church, Father John and I met with Thomas, trying to rebuild his faith. He'd been raised Catholic but hadn't confessed in decades, his pride keeping him from the sacraments. I urged him to make a general confession, to unburden his soul. He resisted, head bowed, muttering, "I'm not worth saving." That's the demon's lie, friends, making you feel beyond God's mercy. I read from Luke 15, the prodigal son, emphasizing the Father's love. Slowly, Thomas began, haltingly, confessing sins of anger, isolation, pride in his self-reliance. As he spoke, the birds outside the church, yes, they'd followed us, grew louder, their cries a protest. I absolved him, tracing the cross, and for the first time in weeks, he looked lighter, a flicker of hope in his eyes. We also prepared the physical space. The exorcism would take place in Thomas's cabin, where Baal's presence was strongest. Father John and I blessed every corner using holy water and salt, praying Psalm 91. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day. The starlings reacted, diving at the windows, their beaks leaving cracks like spider webs. Martha, ever faithful, hung a crucifix above the door, though it rattled as if shaken by an unseen hand. We secured a heavy chair, not to restrain Thomas cruelly, but to keep him safe if the demon lashed out. I brought my stole, the Roman ritual, a relic of St. Benedict, and a vial of oil blessed for anointing. Every item was a weapon, not of force, but of faith, as Ephesians 6 reminds us, the breastplate of righteousness, the sword of the Spirit. Thomas's preparation was the hardest. Baal fought back, sensing our intent. One night, as I prayed with him, he seized, his body rigid, eyes rolling back, a voice not as growling, "You'll fail, priest." I've heard such taunts before, demons mocked to weaken resolve, but I pressed on, reciting the creed. Thomas clawed at his arms, leaving bloody welts, and the birds outside mimicked the voice, chanting in unison. Martha, undeterred, prayed the Hail Mary, and the room grew still, the demon retreating, if only for a moment. We taught Thomas simple prayers, Our Father, Hail Mary, urging him to repeat them when the voices returned. He tried, his voice weak, but each word was a step toward reclaiming his soul. The town was on edge. Word of Paul's attack had spread, and folks avoided Lover's Leap, whispering of curses. Martha's friend, old Henry the logger, came to the church, sharing more stories from the 1940s, how the Order of the Stars rituals left the forest wrong, how animals shunned certain clearings. He gave us a map, hand-drawn, marking a spot near the cliffs where the order met, a place Ezekiel's journal called the altar. I visited it, a half-mile hike through dense woods, and found it a clearing ringed by stones, blackened as if burned, with faint carvings of stars in the earth. The air there was heavy, the birds silent, watching. I blessed the ground but felt resistance, like pushing against a wall. This was Baal's stronghold, tied to the land as much as to Thomas. We enlisted Paul despite his injury. He wasn't a believer, but his brush with death changed him. He offered to monitor the birds during the rite, using his equipment to track their patterns, believing their behavior might signal the demon's reactions. His arm, bandaged and stiff, didn't stop him from setting up cameras around the cabin, capturing footage of the flock forming spirals, stars, even fleeting faces in their swarms. He showed me one clip, chilling, the birds' cries synced with Thomas's muttering as if they were one. Paul said, "Father, this is bigger than science." I nodded, knowing he was seeing what I'd learned in Rome. Evil transcends the material. The Archdiocese approved the exorcism. the bishop's letter arriving by courier. We set the date for a Friday, 3 days away, under a waning moon. I fasted, as did Father John and Martha, preparing our spirits. Thomas, too, tried to fast, though his body was weak, surviving on broth Martha brought. We prayed together daily, building his resolve, reminding him of 1 John 4, "Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world." But Baal wasn't idle. The night before the rite, the cabin shook, doors rattling, windows creaking as if the forest itself rebelled. Thomas woke screaming, "He's coming!" And the birds dove, hundreds crashing into the roof, leaving feathers and blood. I stayed with him, praying through the night, holding the crucifix, knowing the demon was desperate. It was a Friday in November, the air raw at 30 degrees, a storm brewing over the Ohio River, clouds heavy with the threat of rain. Thomas's cabin, a weathered square of logs, stood at the edge of Lover's Leap, its windows cracked from starling assaults, the surrounding oaks alive with thousands of birds, their cries a relentless hymn, pulsing like a heartbeat from hell. Thomas was frail, 35 pounds lighter, his skin gray, his eyes flickering between fear and something darker when Baal spoke through him. Martha Collins, the steadfast neighbor in her 60s, Father John Whitaker, the local priest, and I, trained in Rome and serving as the Archdiocese's exorcist since 2005, had prepared for this moment. The bishop's permission was granted, the cabin blessed, Thomas's faith kindled through confession, but nothing prepares you fully for the battle when the enemy shows its face. We began at dusk, the sky bruised purple, the cabin lit only by candles and a single lantern, casting shadows that danced like specters. Thomas sat in a heavy chair, not bound tightly but secured to keep him safe, his hands trembling, sweat beading despite the cold. Father John stood at my side, holding a crucifix, his face calm but eyes sharp with resolve. Martha knelt in a corner, her rosary clicking softly, her prayers a quiet undercurrent. Paul, the biologist, stayed outside, his injured arm in a sling, cameras rolling to monitor the birds, their behavior a gauge of the demon's reactions. My stole draped over my shoulders, the Roman ritual open in my hands, a relic of Saint Benedict on the table, and a vial of blessed oil ready. We were armed, not with weapons of steel, but with faith, as Ephesians 6 declares, the shield of faith to quench the fiery darts of the evil one. I began with the litany of the saints, my voice steady. Saint Michael, pray for us. Saint Joseph, pray for us. The room grew heavy, the air thick, like breathing through cloth. Thomas twitched, his head jerking, eyes darting to the windows where the starlings pressed, their beaks tapping glass in rhythm with my words. I sprinkled holy water, and Thomas groaned, a low, guttural sound, not his own. The birds answered, their cries rising to a scream, a cacophony that shook the walls. I read from the ritual, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, unclean spirit, to reveal yourself." Thomas's body arched, his chair creaking, and a voice not his roared, "Bow." "I am Baal." The words were Hebrew, Ani Baal, Adon Shel Olam, meaning, I am Baal, Lord of the world. I've heard demons name themselves before. It's their pride, their need to claim power, but this was ancient. Heavy with centuries of malice, the room seemed to shrink, the candlelight dimming as if choked. Martha's prayers grew louder, the Hail Mary cutting through the noise, and Father John held the crucifix higher, his voice joining mine in Psalm 68. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Thomas's eyes rolled back, white showing, and his body convulsed, not wildly, but with a controlled violence, as if the demon was pacing itself. Blood trickled from his nose, a sign of the strain on his body, and I anointed his forehead with oil, tracing the cross. He screamed, a sound that wasn't human, and the birds outside dove at the windows, shattering one. Glass sprang across the floor. Feathers drifted in, black and glistening, forming patterns, circles, stars on the wood. Baal spoke again, through Thomas's lips, mocking, "Your God is weak, priest. This one is mine." I faced such taunts in other cases. Demons thrive on doubt, but I pressed on, reciting the exorcism prayers. I adjure you, ancient serpent, by the judge of the living and the dead, Depart from this servant of God. Thomas's body twisted, his arms straining against the restraints, his voice shifting between his own pleas, "Help me, Father," and Baal's snarls, "He belongs to me." The demon named Thomas's sins, pride, isolation, his refusal of community, claiming they opened the door. I countered with John's gospel. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Each word was a blow, and the birds' cries faltered, their swarm thinning. Martha, bless her, never wavered. She clutched her rosary, praying the Memorare, and when she said, "Mother of God," Thomas's body slumped, as if Baal recoiled. But then came a surge. Thomas's chair rocked, nearly tipping, and a force pushed against us, invisible but heavy, like a gust of wind indoors. Martha fell back, her hips striking the floor, a cry of pain escaping her. Father John rushed to her, but she waved him off, resuming her prayers, her voice trembling but unbroken. I continued, commanding Baal to leave in Christ's name, and the room shook, beams creaking, the lanterns swinging. Paul radioed from outside, his voice crackling. "The birds are going crazy, forming a star in the sky." His footage later showed it. Thousands of starlings swirling into an inverted pentagram, their eyes like embers under the storm clouds. Hours passed, the battle relentless. Thomas's body weakened, his breathing shallow, but his eyes showed fight, mouthing the Our Father between convulsions. I anointed him again, praying Psalm 23, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The demon raged, Thomas's voice screaming, "You'll all burn!" But I felt God's presence, a calm amidst the storm. I held the St. Benedict relic, invoking his intercession, and sprinkled holy water in a circle around Thomas. The birds outside fell silent just for a moment, and Thomas gasped, tears streaming, saying, "I see him, Jesus." That was his soul breaking through, a sign we were gaining ground. But Baal wasn't done. As midnight approached, the storm broke, rain lashing the cabin, thunder rolling like a warning. Thomas's body arched again, his voice booming, "This is my temple," a reference to Lover's Leap, the forest defiled decades ago by the order of the star. I remembered Ezekiel's journal, the clearing where rituals were held, and knew the demon's roots went deep, tied to the land. I prayed harder, invoking the precious blood, and Thomas's convulsions slowed, his body slumping, exhausted. The birds, too, quieted, some dropping to the ground, lifeless, their bodies littering the yard. We paused at dawn, the storm easing, the cabin a wrecked glass shards, feathers, candle wax pooling on the floor. Thomas was still breathing weakly, but the demon's grip hadn't broken. Baal was weakened but stubborn, clinging to Thomas's pride, his fear. I knew we couldn't stop. The rite would continue, but the cost was mounting. Martha, limping from her fall, refused to leave, her prayers our backbone. Father John, his face drawn, held the crucifix like a soldier's sword. Paul, outside, reported the birds dispersing, but not gone, watching from the trees. The exorcism had stretched past dawn. That Friday in November, the air bitter at 30 degrees. Rain from the night storm, dripping from the trees. The Ohio River, a distant murmur. Thomas's cabin, a battered square of logs, was a wreckage, broken glass, scattered feathers, wax hardened on the floor from candles burned low. Thomas was exhausted. His body slumped in the chair, breathing shallow, his eyes flickering with a spark of his own will, though Baal still clung to him, weakened but defiant. Martha Collins, the steadfast neighbor in her 60s, nursed a bruised hip from her fall during the rite, her rosary still in hand, prayers unbroken. Father John Whitaker, the local priest, stood resolute, his crucifix a steady beacon, while Paul, the biologist, watched from outside, his cameras capturing the starlings' eerie patterns. My training in Rome and role as the Archdiocese exorcist since 2005 had led us here, but the battle wasn't over. Baal's taunt, "This is my temple," pointed to the forest itself, and Thomas's sudden flight into Lover's Leap forced us to follow. It happened as the first light broke, gray and weak through the clouds. We paused the rite, thinking Thomas needed rest, but his eyes snapped open, no longer his own pupils black, glinting like the starling's eyes. He tore free from the chair's restraints, not with human strength, but something else, his movements jerky, like a marionette. Before we could react, he bolted, crashing through the shattered door, his voice, not his shouting, "To the altar," in Hebrew, La Mizbeach. The starlings erupted, thousands rising from the oaks, forming a black cloud that followed him, their cries a deafening chant. Father John and I grabbed our ritual kits, holy water, crucifix, the Roman ritual, and ran after him, Martha limping behind, refusing to stay back despite her pain. Paul radioed, "He's heading to the cliffs," his voice crackling with fear as he tracked the birds swarm on his monitors. The forest was alive, not with nature's rhythm, but with something wrong. The trail, a half-mile path to the clearing Ezekiel's journal called the altar, was muddy, roots twisting underfoot. The air grew heavier, like breathing through fog, and the starlings swarmed above, their wings blotting out the sky, forming shapes, spirals, stars, faces that flickered and vanished. Thomas ran faster than a man his age, weakened by months of torment, should have, his bare feet bleeding on rocks, his breath ragged but driven. I've seen this in possession cases, the demon lending unnatural strength, pushing the body beyond its limits. We followed, our boots slipping, prayers on our lips. Saint Michael, defend us in battle. We reached the clearing, a wide circle ringed by blackened stones, the same place Henry the Logger had marked on his map, where the Order of the Star held their rituals in the 1940s. An ancient oak, gnarled and towering, stood at the center, its branches heavy with starlings, their eyes like embers. Thomas stood beneath it, arms raised, his body trembling, not from cold, but from the force within. His voice boomed, "This is my place. Baal reigns here." The words were Hebrew again, laced with arrogance, and the birds answered, their cries forming a rhythm like a hymn to a false god. I felt the ground pulse, as if the earth itself resisted us, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and decay. I began the rite of exorcism again, my voice cutting through the din. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, Baal, to depart." I sprinkled holy water, and the ground hissed, steam rising where it fell. Thomas's body twisted, his head snapping back, and he levitated not high, but enough, his feet an inch off the ground, a sign of the demon's power. I've seen this before, in rare cases, and it's not theatrics, it's the enemy's desperate show of strength. Father John held the crucifix aloft, chanting Psalm 68, "Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered." The starlings dove, not at Thomas, but at us, their beaks grazing my face, drawing blood. Martha, undaunted, prayed the Memorare, her voice a beacon, and the birds faltered, some dropping lifeless to the ground. Belial spoke through Thomas, its voice a growl, "You cannot take this temple, the order gave it to me." It named names people from the 1940s, long dead, who'd spilled blood here, binding the demon to the land. I countered with the precious blood of Christ, anointing Thomas's forehead from a distance. The oil sizzling as it touched him, he screamed, a dual sound, his own pain and Baal's rage, and fell to his knees, the levitation broken. The starlings swarmed tighter, forming an inverted pentagram above, their cries deafening. Paul, who'd followed us, radioed, "The cameras are glitching, their static faces in the feed." His voice shook, a man of science facing the impossible. Martha, despite her injury, crawled closer, clutching her rosary, praying to the Blessed Virgin. When she said, "Mother of God, intercede," Thomas's body convulsed, and the oak above shuddered, branches snapping as if struck by lightning. I pressed on, reading from the Roman ritual. "I adjure you, ancient serpent, by the cross of Christ, leave this servant of God." Thomas's eyes bled, not tears but blood, streaking his face, a sign of the demon's strain. He clawed at the ground, digging up dirt and stones, revealing more carvings, stars, circles, etched decades ago. The forest seemed to groan, the air vibrating with a low hum, like a heartbeat from the earth. Then came the tragedy. As I invoked St. Michael, A gust tore through the clearing, unnatural, carrying the stench of rot. A branch from the oak, thick as a man's arm, broke free, falling with a crack. Father John, standing closest, didn't see it. It struck his head, and he collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Martha screamed, crawling to him, but I couldn't stop the rite demanded focus. I checked John's pulse, faint, then gone. He was with God now, a martyr in this battle. My heart sank, but I clung to the cross, praying harder, knowing his sacrifice strengthened us. Martha wept, but prayed through her tears, her voice calling on the saints. Thomas's body arched again, Baal roaring, "You lose, priest." But I felt God's presence, a calm amidst the chaos. I held the Saint Benedict relic, commanding, "By the power of Christ, leave this man and this place." The starlings fell silent, hundreds dropping dead, carpeting the clearing. Thomas collapsed, his body still, and the air lightened, the hum fading. Baal was weakening, its hold on the land, and Thomas breaking. I anointed him, praying Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd," and he whispered, "Jesus, save me," his voice his own. The storm cleared, dawn's light piercing the clouds. Thomas lay unconscious but breathing, free at last. The starlings were gone, the clearing quiet, the oak's branches bare. But the cost was heavy, Father John's life, Martha's injury, Paul's shaken soul. We carried Thomas back to the cabin, his body light as a child's, and mourned John, whose faith had bolstered us. Baal was driven out, but the forest held its scars, a reminder of sin's lasting echo. The dawn, after the exorcism, broke cold and clear, the air sharp at 32 degrees, the Ohio River glinting like polished steel under a sky washed clean by the night's storm. Thomas's cabin, that battered square of logs, stood silent, its broken windows and feather-strewn floor, a testament to the battle waged within and beyond. Thomas lay unconscious but alive, his body frail, 35 pounds lighter, his face etched with lines of suffering, but now peaceful, free from Baal's grip. Martha Collins, the steadfast neighbor in her 60s, sat by his side, her hip bruised and swollen, her rosary still clutched, her prayers a quiet hum of gratitude. Paul, the biologist, stood outside, his injured arm in a sling, staring at the empty oaks where the starlings had vanished, his cameras silent, their footage a haunting record of the night's chaos. But the weight of loss hung heavy. Father John Whitaker, the local priest, had given his life in the forest, struck down by a falling branch, a martyr in this spiritual war. My training in Rome and role as the Archdiocese exorcist since 2005 had prepared me for battle, but not for the grief that followed. We carried Thomas back to the cabin, his body light as a child's, and laid him on a cot by the fire Martha rekindled. He stirred, his eyes opening briefly, whispering, "It's gone, thank God," before slipping back into sleep. His pulse was steady, his breathing even a miracle, given the strain of possession. I anointed him once more with blessed oil, praying Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," sealing his deliverance with gratitude. But my heart ached for Father John, whose crucifix still lay in the clearing, blood-streaked from his fall. We retrieved his body, Martha weeping softly, Paul helping despite his injury, his face pale with shock. We brought John to the church 10 miles away, where the congregation gathered, stunned by his loss but strengthened by his sacrifice. I celebrated a Mass for his soul, preaching on John 15. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for his friends." The town mourned, but their faith held firm, a testament to John's ministry. Martha's injury was worse than we thought. At the hospital, doctors found a fractured hip, requiring surgery and a long recovery. She'd walk with a cane forever, a physical scar from her courage. Yet she never wavered, telling me, "Father, I do it again for Thomas, for John." Her faith was a beacon, reminding me of Hebrews 11. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. She moved to her daughter's home in Indianapolis, 50 miles away, but kept her rosary, praying daily for Thomas and the town. Paul, shaken to his core, abandoned his skepticism. He didn't convert, not yet, but he attended Mass, sitting quietly in the back, his scientific mind wrestling with what he'd seen, birds forming pentagrams, voices in his recordings. Thomas's impossible strength. He shared his footage with me, clips showing the starlings' unnatural patterns, faces flickering in their swarms, evidence no lab could explain. Father, he said, I don't know what I believe, but I know what I saw. Thomas's recovery was slow. He woke the next day, weak but lucid, his memory fragmented. He recalled the whispers, the dreams of a cloaked figure, the knife in his hand against Paul. But it felt like a nightmare, not his own actions. I stayed with him, counseling him to return to the sacraments, to rebuild his life with community, not isolation. He confessed again, tears streaming, releasing years of pride and loneliness. The Archdiocese arranged for him to stay with a Catholic family in town, as his cabin was uninhabitable, windows shattered, walls scarred with occult symbols. Thomas never returned to ranger work. The forest held too many memories. He took a job in town, repairing boats by the river, and attended Mass weekly, his faith fragile but growing, like a seedling after a fire. Lover's Leap itself was changed. The clearing where we'd fought BAAL, ringed by blackened stones, was quiet now, the starlings gone, their bodies cleared by volunteers. But the town knew its history, Ezekiel's journal, the Order of the Star, the rituals from the 1940s. I led a blessing of the land, sprinkling holy water over the clearing, praying Psalm 91. You will not fear the terror of the night. The air felt lighter, but the ground held scars, faint carvings of stars, too deep to erase. The church declared the area off limits, posting signs warning hikers to avoid the cliffs at night. Locals whispered of seeing birds, not starlings, but crows, gathering on foggy evenings, their eyes glinting, a reminder that evil, though defeated, lingers where sin took root. I returned to my parish in Brownsburg, 50 miles away, carrying the weight of this case. In my work, I've seen many battles, but this one marked me. Father John's death, Martha's sacrifice, Thomas's deliverance. I kept John's crucifix cleaned of blood on my altar, a reminder of his courage. I prayed for him daily, trusting he was with the saints. The town held a memorial, naming a street after him, a quiet tribute to a man who faced darkness with faith. Thomas visited me months later, thinner but stronger, thanking me with a handshake, his eyes clear. Father, he said, I was lost, but God found me. I smiled, quoting Romans 8, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Of Thrash, the lessons of this case endure. BAAL, as Scripture warns in 2 Kings, preys on pride, isolation, those who think they need no one, not even God. Thomas's solitude opened the door, and the forest history, those occult rituals, gave BAAL a foothold. But Christ's power, through the church's rite, through prayer and sacrifice, broke that hold. Yet the cost reminds us, spiritual warfare is real, and it demands vigilance. As 1 Peter 5 says, be sober, be vigilant. Your adversary, the devil, prowls like a roaring lion. Lover's Leap remains, beautiful but scarred, a warning to guard our souls, to seek community, to cling to faith. I carry this story in my heart, friends, as I continue my ministry. It's not about fear, but about hope. Hope in Christ's victory, in the saints' intercession, in the power of prayer. Thomas lives, Martha endures, and Father John's sacrifice shines as a light. Hold fast to your faith, for as Revelation 12 declares, they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. The battle is won, but the war goes on. Stay close to God, and he will keep you. God bless you all.